Thanks to Miss Spudnut for helping with the funding for this video. If you'd like to have your own shoutout or get some special perks on the side, join the channel as a member today. These perks are also available through Patreon and Ko-fi, so if you'd like to stop there instead, feel free to do so. The links are in the description. Well, here we are, fellas. We fought through another grueling year, and the stress and exhaustion are already showing. Though most of us survived, it's best to keep in mind that we still have to keep the fight flowing for, well, pretty much the remainder of our sad, lonely existence, lest we end up falling into that big black pit of despair, with little to no chance of living to see the joyous daylight ever again. Okay, that's it for the yearly melodrama. And now, yes! We're at the tail end of 2024, everyone. Just one more day before we wake up to 2025 and try our best to start anew. So for this closing of the year, I figured we'd add a little tradition that kinda started up last year. After wrapping up 2023 with that Spider-Verse video, I felt the drive to see if we can bring that mood back by looking at a beloved movie from this year too. And let me say, there were a handful from the 24 releases that had a bit of substance to discuss. But at the same time, I also noticed a bit of a theme here. I found there was a surprising variety of sequels we got from this year alone. Sure, some may have come out rather mid, like Joker 2, Despicable Me 4, Kung Fu Panda 4. Those kinds of sequels were thankfully overshadowed by a lot of surprising treats scattered around, like Deadpool and Wolverine, Smile 2, Dune Part 2, and even the long-awaited Beetlejuice sequel. But above all that, there's one sequel I've known a lot of people were looking forward to, and I've seen the praise still holding up fairly strong in some circles to this day. That film being Inside Out 2. And I can say with absolute certainty that the hype and praise for this movie was definitely something else, because in only a few months, this ended up gaining the highest profit for any animated movie in history. Yes, that's right. All those other animated movies out there, regardless of the length of their legacy, they all got passed by this one. Like the Shrek movies, the Toy Story movies, the Frozen movies, the Ice Age movies, even the Spider-Verse movies. Inside Out 2 managed to make more money than any of those other installments. And that's how you know this is going to be on a different level. And I could tell I was going to have quite an interesting experience with this movie too, as I admittedly never saw the first one. But I did know enough about it to get the idea going in. And of course I did see the first movie more recently for this video, but at the time I still got some enjoyment from the sequel regardless, which is another sign of a great film. Sure, it probably would have been better had I taken the time to sit down and watch the first one beforehand, but this movie still managed to offer some great elements that helped it stand out on its own, all while working off the foundation from the movie before it. And I can already hear some fellas out there saying, "Yo, Nunion, you had 9 years to watch this movie. What gives, fam?" Well, made as embarrassed as I am about that part of my life, this movie came out at a time when I was still in high school, and I'm sure most of us had that time in our lives when we were under the impression we were getting too old for something, only to come back to it a couple years later. Well, that's what the Disney Pixar stuff felt like to me at the time, and it certainly didn't help that the biggest thing around that time happened to be Frozen. And while that movie isn't as bad as I remember it being, I still recall being bored out of my mind when I was watching it back then. And seeing that this was the big picture at the time, this had me even more discouraged about the future works from Disney and Pixar. And yes, that even included the movie about adventures with a child's emotions and the challenges and conflict that derive from them throughout their life. Man, I was so close-minded back then. But now as a mid-20s man with a much broader understanding on so many different elements and aspects, and with a more analytical side developed since then, I get why so many people have been interested in seeing an Inside Out sequel particularly. Even after its release, I can see why a lot of the fascination still holds up months later. And yeah, I know I've been talking for a while now, but before going into the actual movies themselves, I felt as usual it would help to go through a bit of the history on how this movie came about in the first place. But don't worry fellas, I have a feeling you might find this history portion to be a little more interesting than some from the past. Let's see what you think. The earliest sign of the first movie's life goes back as far as 2009, and was brought to existence thanks to Pete Docter and Ronnie Del Carmen. Now, Pete at the time noticed a few changes coming from his daughter Ellie, particularly based on how she'd respond and interact with different things around her. And this got Pete wondering, hey now, what's up with that? So to find his answer, he went around sharing discussions with a team of psychologists, neuroscientists, and specialists, and even got involvement from a whole university at some point. Over time, he got to learn a lot more about the different emotions than he ever would have thought. and he got to see all the different ways they could behave and change, which to him felt like how a character would evolve and develop in a story. And this gave him the idea to take these common emotions and give them personality traits and paths. All this planning would also help shape Riley, the girl whose head they all work inside. Sometime later, Ronnie enters the scene. He found Pete's research admirable and inspiring enough to make all this into a potential movie. And thanks to Ronnie's experience with older Pixar films at the time, he was able to help Pete get in touch with the studio itself and help bring his findings to greater heights, leading all the way up to the big screen and gaining a sequel about 9 years later. As I said, I downright avoided this and a lot of other Pixar and Disney movies at the time, as I was in a stubborn high school teen state back then. And, well, I felt like I was simply just too old by that point. But looking back on it now, this feels more like I wouldn't have been old enough to fully appreciate or maybe understand a good portion of the thought process that was put into a movie like this. And while there was a lot of consideration to unpack in the first movie alone, including the second movie as well, I'd like to get some of the surface elements out of the way first, like the presentation and details and aesthetic to help build up the first movie on its own. The visuals starting off are what you'd expect for a Pixar film around this era, just the usual CG approach for a start. However, this time they filled a lot of the details with a wide variety of special glows and colors to help differentiate a lot of these elements and help present the mood that's coming from each of them. And this also works in the sense that a lot of these come solely from the emotions themselves. Seeing the different memories and the amount of said memories coming from each emotion help indicate the kind of person Riley is thanks to her emotions. These details are further boosted seeing the start of her life from birth, and shown through different implications through different parts of her life growing up and leading up to this point. This is also shown through the different tones that come from all these memories. And speaking of, you can see a surprising amount of the yellow memories. Like, wow. There seems to be a lot, huh? Well, we'll go more into that later when we get into the actual story. As for the choice of casting, I'll admit I didn't recognize all the voice actors, but they still did a great job of their portrayal. Like Caelynn Diaz as Riley, Phyllis Smith as Sadness, and Amy Poehler? Hopefully I pronounced that right? But she did a great job as Joy too. Then there were the cast members I could pick up right off the bat. Like with Anger, for example. I knew he sounded familiar, as his voice was done by Lewis Black, which a lot of you might know as Ricky from Mystery Incorporated. And, man, that alone tells me, if I had a nickel for every big production I covered this year that he was covered in, I'd have— Don't say it! And we had Fear, voiced by Bill Hader. Now him I've been seeing popping up a lot, and I gotta say, he's given off a lot of enjoyable characters from what I've seen. And this performance was certainly no exception. And last there's Disgust, played by Mindy Kaling, which— yeah, we know what she's been up to in these recent years. Alright, now for the story. So these emotions basically operate Riley and provide her reactions and decisions to, well, pretty much everything around her. Yeah, it sounds simple enough, that is, until it all starts falling out of whack. And from there, everything starts going more towards the deep philosophical side, consisting of a load of creative puns and some kind of clever play on words. But more importantly, we also get scenes that really dive down and give everyone time to think and reflect on what Riley's dealing with in her head. And let me tell you, the first time watching, those really started to hit me on the inside. Because honestly, I could see a lot of this from her perspective and feel connected to different points of my past too. And I'm sure we could all feel that same way thinking back to one point or another in our lives too. Whether it's the scenarios themselves or even the type of heft that they carry. One scene in particular that really stood out to me in a more personal route was Riley's first day of school. It seemed like a fair start until tension rose from Sadness bringing back the negativity from one of Riley's memories. And it was there where I really started to feel some of Riley's life as if it were my own. For a lot of us, I'm sure there's bound to be something that adds a great deal of warmth and positivity to our lives, only for a heap of negativity to start taking over, regardless of whether or not it was intended to be there in the first place. This could be a feeling that develops naturally from your own being, or maybe this feeling started getting crammed into your thoughts at some point in your life. That kind of force might come from a stranger, or maybe someone you're close with, like a friend or someone in your family. And I had this feeling that just about all of us have felt that kind of way at least once somewhere in our past. An experience like that can be enough to see where Riley's coming from, and not just in this scene, but in other scenes too. You see the struggles and the hardships she starts to face to the point where she even considers running away. Sometimes people might have that kind of decision, and it might not entirely be in their own control. Or so the context shows here through Riley. And again, it's not just this scene. The mood flows into a lot of pieces in later moments too, particularly when they show the islands getting destroyed. And Joy starts thinking back to more of Riley's memories as she starts watching them fall and break apart. It adds on to the kind of feeling making you think, yikes. Is this it? Will Riley be able to feel that form of positivity or have these details to her ever again? And then, that's where the point comes into play. I was very surprised to have not seen this coming. I kinda have my own predictions based on the context and even some personal elements I've been going through in recent years. But despite all that, they made it very clear in the narrative that Joy was a control freak. She saw herself and what was best for Riley and her core memories. She always thought that by suppressing sadness, she'd be able to keep Riley's positive side going forever. Which, yeah, I guess that can go different ways. Perhaps you're someone who's been dealing with or feeling a crushing force of negativity weighing down on you day after day. Or maybe you try to ignore that feeling and try to make the atmosphere around you as happy as possible. It's like a double-bladed sword. But the logic starts showing through at a smoother rate here. A lot of people would probably assume that Joy was in the right this whole time and hope that positivity prevailed. And I admit, I too had this habit of going off that very mindset. And maybe more than I probably should too. Sometimes just out of the blue, I might find myself getting the sense of the negative shell from a lot of people I see, regardless of whether or not I even know them. And that could potentially lead to a lot of people like me thinking some positivity, maybe even if desperate measures are required, could help make the general atmosphere and their personal atmosphere all the better. Sometimes I see that part of Joy and thinking it could be great help for anyone. But then sadness starts to show her value through their whole journey together. Through Bing Bong and Riley's dreams and delivering further context reflected through some of Riley's memories. I guess it shows that in some scenarios, not everything has to be over the top positive, and there should be more of a balance in a lot of those aspects of life. The same goes for Riley's aspects too, like her school life, her interactions with her friends and family, and her passion for hockey and ice skating. But okay, enough of the deep stuff. What else do we have detail-wise? Well, we've got some other elements thrown in for extra story details. One I remember was the emotions from Riley's parents that are given a bit of their own spotlight too. Albeit in a few scattered scenes like other emotions we see from other people too, but still that's mostly for scattered scenes in the story and mostly jokes on the side. But hey, that's perfectly fine, as these jokes have fair stability in their own way, especially for those who can picture this type of scenario from within pairings of their own family or those around them, plus I highly doubt they would have had the time or the space to flesh out their emotions as much as Riley's. But maybe they can follow through with some kind of separate side project or future installment. Who knows? Still, this movie had a lot going into it, and I can't believe I skipped out on this one for so long. I do blame my obnoxious teen self back then for that, but also my dubious nature I had too. This whole time, even knowing the nature of the story, I never would have expected this movie to leave such a changing nature and still leave such a light of hope on life. In a way, it's very touching. And I'm glad you fellas talked me into watching this after so many years. So thank you. This video was sponsored by...
Triple then come. We'll make you smile.
Really? Again with this song? Oh, for God's sake, Sam, you little...
Triple then come.
During the years between these two movies, Disney and Pixar were making quite the handful of sequels with their other works, although most of them could have gone a little better. Like we've had Finding Dory, Frozen 2, Toy Story 4, and Ralph Breaks the Internet? Yeah, so not exactly the best of sequels were offered in between. And for a while, it looked like there was going to be a field of quality misses for the Disney Pixar team. That is until this year when we got this sequel, Inside Out 2. And, well, going into the theater, I still had optimism, despite remembering the unbalanced history of all those other sequels and just acknowledging them. And yet, when looking back on this one and the first movie, I was still pleasantly surprised to see that Inside Out 2 had some substance to it that came off better than the first. Granted, they didn't bring the whole cast back together, mainly Bill or Mindy, which can be a bit of a shame, but hey, the newer cast choices still gave a pretty decent performance, all things considered. And besides, it's the story and where we are now that really helped boost this up. Riley's now 13, which of course many of us can say from experience, a lot can happen in even a small time gap like this. And this movie gives us a great deal of examples throughout. Multiple details from the first movie were expanded upon to show out through Riley, like her fondness for hockey, putting her on a big team, her interactions through different relationships, and how far she's willing to go for them, and sometimes seeing more negative effects from them than I'm sure she was expecting, her sense of self, and her new emotions gained through puberty. What was merely foreshadowed at the end of the first movie is now given a much bigger focus through the heightened results of her original emotions and the later workings of her new emotions. Those new emotions being ennui, embarrassment, envy, and especially anxiety. Essentially, anxiety becomes what joy used to be in the first movie, but in a much more negative light. Yeah, I'm sure you all could have seen that coming, as just about everyone's felt that kind of thing in some point of their lives. Just that feeling of reacting out of anxiety, thinking it'll lead to what you want and keep you thinking as it may help in some ways. You stick with that feeling too hard and it could lead to some kind of panic or unpleasant feeling inside. Remember back when we looked through Puss in Boots: The Last Wish? Well, similar feelings can be applied there. Though, of course, that was on a more extreme level, as Puss wanted to save himself from death and keep his legacy and adventures going. And this led to him seeing death everywhere and putting him on the edge the whole time. In that kind of environment, minus the drastic risks, is basically what we see Riley going through too. And it's a lot more down to earth, so a lot of people, maybe even of different generations, can feel how these changes are weighing her down over time. Especially with anxiety in her team justifying it all and placing the consequences on Riley, both physically and mentally. And speaking of, that leads to a detail in the movie that really spoke out to me. During my first viewing, even if the outcome would have been predictable to some people, and maybe in some ways me included, I was still all over the place going back and forth thinking to myself, oh god, what's the plan here? Is Joy trying too hard to run everything herself again? Well, that can't be it, since all the other base emotions are just as involved as she is this time. So what about anxiety? Maybe she knows what she's doing then, right? Well, it doesn't seem like that either. Because just look at what she's doing to Riley and herself. See where the results take them both. But like last time, despite my way of usually seeing through something like this, I was again surprised when it was revealed that both sides were in the wrong in some ways. Sure, anxiety's issues are a lot more obvious and straightforward, as she's going by a more corrupt route. Like in Riley's imagination, for example. She goes out of her way just to find and fill Riley's head with any and all negative outcomes she can face, and even preparing her for the most drastic outcomes possible, even if unnecessary. As for Joy, she tried to shape Riley by tossing some of what she thought to be the most unwanted memories into the back of her head. And yeah, it's as bad as it sounds. Certainly not as harmful as what anxiety was shown to do, but it can still lead to some problems from what I've learned. Considering details like these and finding out how to fix them is said to be the first big step to a strong balance in mental health. Anxiety can come around within any of us in different situations. It's only natural. But if it and similar feelings take over and start calling your shots, it could put you through some outcomes you might not like. Be it peer pressure, paranoia, shoving yourself into cliques, and maybe other desperate measures. And again, it shows how important your mental health can be, and that's not just for kids. An anxiety attack can feel like this for anyone at any age, and you should seek the help you may need when needed. Overall, it's really nice to see how much thought they put into this movie. And it's just as nice that they reached out to Lisa D'Amour, a skilled psychologist, for her input in the story. And what we were left with might probably be one of the greatest outcomes a lot of us may have imagined with this scenario. There are also some side details I remembered for their amusement and impact, like we get to see some of Riley's secrets, with the deep dark one presumably getting more attention in a later chapter. I'm not entirely sure yet. Though really, the new characters I mostly remembered were Pouchy and Bluefy. No, Bluefy! Yeah, him. These fellas have some decent design, and their 2D animation works pretty well with this Pixar atmosphere. They've got amusing moments interacting with the emotions, and can be of great help through said moments. So they're pretty fine characters in general, but what about Bing Bong? Bing Bong will live. And sometimes there are those smaller moments that keep opening up to me in some ways. Like in the first movie, we've seen Joy have a few meltdowns, but this time there's also a bit of outrage in her too. This kind of stuff reminds me that even the most positive people you may know, even if you're that positive person, can have a breaking point. This could happen even if you try to give it your all to make everyone around you happier. It could lead to stress and maybe a snap like this, and at times you can see it's really nothing to be upset about. We have our negative moments, but sometimes it's best to carry on. And given this movie, even at my age, I never thought I'd see such a clean balance of this kind of conflict from a Pixar story of all things. And as rare as it might be for me to say, I do see a lot of potential in another sequel. Like maybe we can see Riley older, maybe in her later teens or 20s or something, and maybe we can see where her emotions lead her from there. I'd totally watch that. But at the same time, part of me feels like we should wait a bit to see where it goes from here. If worse comes to worse, I worry this might lead to another Spider-Verse fiasco, with harsh work circumstances and drama behind the scenes, and I really don't want to see it go down like that. Regardless, I'd like to think there'll be a bright future for Pixar after seeing how this movie turned out, and looking back on it, there was a fairly bright past too. which includes a few movies I'll certainly have to catch up on. And maybe as time goes on, they can show similar strength in the future works too. But like I always say at the end of these videos, we'll soon see, won't we? Thank you all for the memories of 2024, and let's all hope for a decent 2025 ahead of us. Happy New Year, everyone!